Rachel Langford watched her father die slow, gasping, coughing blood, after the only well on their land was poisoned. 3 days later, she set the table for 3 guests and poured the water herself. The Texas sun beat down on the Langford ranch like a blacksmith's hammer on steel. Dust devils danced across the cracked earth, mocking the parched landscape. This was the late 1800s, and a terrible drought had gripped the valley for months. Rachel Langford, barely 20 summers old, stood by the fence, her heart heavy. The one-screen pastures were now brown and brittle. The creek bed was dry, and the only source of water was the well dug deep into the earth. But even the well was failing them. The cattle, once strong and healthy, now staggered weakly, their ribs showing through their dusty hides. They moaned with thirst, their eyes pleading. Rachel loved her cattle. They were her family's livelihood, their hope for the future. Now they were dying one by one. It started subtly, a few sickly animals, then more began to collapse. Rachel watched, helpless, as they convulsed, their bodies racked with pain. Foam bubbled from their mouths. She didn't understand. The drought was bad, but this was different. This was wrong. The dying continued. Rachel tried everything she could think of. She rationed the water, she moved the healthiest cattle to a small, shaded area near the house. She even prayed, but nothing seemed to work. Each morning she would find another animal lying still, its eyes glazed over. The other ranchers in the valley were suffering too, but not like this. Their cattle were thin, yes, but they weren't dying at this rate. A cold knot of fear began to tighten in Rachel's stomach. One afternoon, as she was hauling buckets of water to a calf that couldn't stand, she noticed something odd. There was a strange, oily sheen on the surface of the water in the bucket. She sniffed it cautiously. A faint, bitter smell stung her nostrils. It wasn't the clean, earthy smell of well water. This was something else, something unnatural. Her heart pounded in her chest as the terrible realization dawned on her. Someone had poisoned the well, but who and why? The fear soon became a crushing weight. Rachel's father, a strong, weathered man who had carved a life out of this harsh land, started to cough. A deep, rattling cough that shook his entire body. He grew weaker each day, his face pale and gaunt. He drank deeply from the well, trying to quench his thirst in the relentless heat. Rachel begged him to stop, but he wouldn't listen. "It's just the dust, girl," he'd rasp, waving her away. "A man needs his water." One morning, Rachel found him lying near the well, his body contorted in pain. His breathing was shallow and ragged. The same foam that had bubbled from the cattle's mouths now coated his lips. Rachel cradled his head in her lap, tears streaming down her face. She knew with a chilling certainty that the poison that had killed her cattle was now killing her father. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a terrible understanding. He tried to speak, but only a gurgling sound escaped his throat. Then his eyes closed and he was gone. Rachel was alone. Sheriff Brody arrived the next day, his face grim. He examined the body, listened to Rachel's tearful account, and shook his head. "A tragic accident, Rachel," he said, his voice weary. "The drought's got everyone desperate, probably just bad water." Rachel stared at him, her eyes burning with anger. "It wasn't an accident, Sheriff," she insisted. "The well was poisoned." Brody sighed. "Now, Rachel, you're just grieving. Things like this happen. It's God's will." The preacher, a portly man with a booming voice, echoed the sheriff's sentiment. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he intoned, offering empty platitudes about acceptance and faith. Rachel clenched her fists. Their words were hollow, offering no comfort, no justice. They didn't want to see the truth. They didn't want to believe that someone in their community was capable of such cruelty. But Rachel knew better. She knew in her heart that this was no accident, no act of God. This was murder. And she knew who was responsible: the Millers and the Claytons. Their names echoed in Rachel's mind like a death knell. They were the neighboring landowners, their ranches sprawling on either side of the Langford property. They had always coveted her family's land, a fertile stretch of the valley with prime access to the dwindling water resources. She remembered their visits, polite at first, then increasingly insistent. They offered to buy the Langford ranch, lowballing them with insulting offers. Her father had always refused. "This land is our legacy," he'd said, his voice firm. "It's not for sale." But after years of drought, desperation had begun to creep into their voices. The veiled threats started subtly. "It's a hard life out here for a woman alone," Jeb Miller had said, his eyes glinting with a predatory gleam. "Maybe it's time you considered your options." Now Rachel understood. They hadn't just wanted her land, they had been willing to kill for it. And they thought they had gotten away with it, but they were wrong. Rachel Langford was not going to be driven off her land. She would have her revenge. The grief didn't fade, but it was slowly replaced by a cold, unwavering determination. Rachel spent the next few days in quiet preparation. She cleaned the house, mended her clothes, and sharpened her father's old hunting knife. Each task was performed with a deliberate, almost ritualistic precision. She wasn't consumed by rage, but by a chilling calm. The tears had stopped flowing, replaced by a steely glint in her eyes. She would not scream, she would not beg, she would not break, she would simply act. She thought about running, about leaving the valley and starting a new life somewhere else. But that would be a surrender. It would be letting the Millers and Claytons win. And Rachel Langford was not a quitter. This land was her birthright, her family's legacy. She would defend it even if it meant sacrificing everything. The decision was made. Revenge would be her solace and justice would be served. She wrote 3 letters, short and formal. Mr. Miller, one read, I would be honored if you would join me for supper at my home on the evening of the 14th. I wish to discuss matters of mutual concern regarding the future of the valley. Sincerely, Rachel Langford. The other 2 letters were identical, addressed to Mr. Clayton and Mr. Clayton's son. She saddled her father's old horse and rode to each ranch, delivering the invitations herself. She kept her face expressionless, her voice polite but firm. The men were surprised, even wary. They exchanged glances, their eyes narrowed with suspicion. Supper, huh? Jeb Miller drawled, stroking his beard. What's this about Rachel? Just a friendly gathering, Mr. Miller, she replied, her gaze unwavering. A chance to clear the air. They accepted, of course. They couldn't resist the opportunity to see what she was up to perhaps finally pressure her into selling. They underestimated Rachel Langford. They had no idea what awaited them. The day of the supper arrived, hot and still. Rachel spent the afternoon preparing the meal. She baked a simple bread, roasted a scrawny chicken, and gathered vegetables from her small garden. But her most important task was the water. She drew several buckets from the well, carefully avoiding the oily residue that still clung to the surface. She strained the water through a clean cloth, then placed it in the coolest part of the cellar to chill. As it cooled, she retrieved a small vial from a hidden compartment in her father's desk. It contained a potent poison, one he had used for killing coyotes that preyed on his livestock. With steady hands, she measured out the poison, carefully adding it to the chilled water. She stirred it slowly, ensuring it was thoroughly mixed. The cold temperature would mask the bitter taste, making it almost undetectable. She worked in silence, her face set in a mask of grim determination. The stage was set, the players were ready, and Rachel Langford was about to serve a deadly supper. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the valley, the 3 men arrived. Jeb Miller, a burly man with a cruel smile, was the first to dismount. He was followed by Clayton, an older, more reserved man, and his son, a young man with shifty eyes. Rachel greeted them at the door, her face calm and composed. "Welcome," she said, her voice steady. "Please come in." The men entered the house, their eyes scanning the room, taking in every detail. The table was set with simple but clean dishes. 3 chairs were neatly arranged around it. A single lamp cast a warm glow over the scene. An uncomfortable silence hung in the air. The men shifted their weight, their arrogance masking their unease. They sensed something was different about Rachel, something unsettling. But they couldn't quite put their finger on it. They were about to find out. Rachel served the meal, placing the roasted chicken and vegetables on the table. The men ate with a forced politeness, making small talk about the drought and the dwindling water supply. Rachel listened quietly, offering only brief responses. "So, Rachel," Jeb Miller said, wiping his mouth with a napkin, "what did you want to talk about? We're busy men." Rachel looked at him, her eyes cold and unwavering. "I wanted to talk about the future of this valley," she said, her voice soft but firm, "about the land and who deserves to own it." Clayton shifted in his chair, his gaze darting around the room. "We've made you offers, Rachel," he said. "Good offers, it's time you accepted them." Rachel smiled, a thin, mirthless smile. "I'm not selling," she said. "This land is mine, and I intend to keep it." She stood and walked to the sideboard where 3 glasses stood waiting. She carefully poured the chilled water into each glass, the liquid shimmering in the lamplight. The men watched her, their eyes narrowed, their suspicion growing. The silence in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Rachel carried the glasses to the table, placing one in front of each man. "Water," she said simply, "the most precious thing in this valley." The men hesitated, their gazes fixed on the glasses. They knew something was wrong, but they couldn't resist the temptation. The drought had made them desperate, and the cool, clear water looked inviting. "To the future," Rachel said, raising her glass. "May it bring prosperity and peace to this valley." The men exchanged glances, then slowly raised their glasses. "To the future," they echoed, their voices wary. They were about to drink their last. They drank. The water was cool and refreshing, the faint bitterness masked by the chill. For a moment they seemed to relax, their suspicion easing. But then the poison began to work its way through their systems. Jeb Miller was the first to react. His face flushed, and he began to cough, a deep, rattling cough that echoed in the small room. He clutched at his throat, his eyes wide with panic. Clayton, the older man, gasped, his hand flying to his chest. His face contorted in pain, and he slumped forward in his chair. His son, his eyes filled with terror, stared at Rachel, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Rachel watched them, her face expressionless, her eyes cold and hard. She felt no pity, no remorse. They had poisoned her well, killed her cattle, and murdered her father. They deserved this. "You poisoned us." The younger Clayton gasped, his voice choked with pain. He lunged towards Rachel, his hands outstretched, but his body was already failing him. He collapsed onto the floor, convulsing violently. Jeb Miller, his face contorted with rage, managed to stand, swaying unsteadily. "You crazy woman," he roared, his voice hoarse. "You'll pay for this." Rachel remained calm, her voice steady. "You were the ones who started this," she said. "You poisoned my well, killed my cattle, murdered my father. I'm just finishing it." Clayton, the older man, looked at her with a mixture of fear and understanding. "We just wanted the land," he croaked, his voice weak. "This land is not yours to take," Rachel said, her voice filled with steel. "It belongs to my family, and I will defend it no matter what." The silence of death began to fill the room. The convulsions subsided. Jeb Miller collapsed back into his chair, his eyes staring blankly at the ceiling. Clayton, the older man, lay still on the floor, his body twisted at an unnatural angle. Only Clayton's son remained alive, his breathing shallow and ragged. He looked at Rachel, his eyes filled with a desperate plea. "Why?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. Rachel knelt beside him, her face inches from his. "Because you took everything from me," she said, her voice cold and unwavering. "Now I'm taking it back." She watched as the last spark of life faded from his eyes. Then she stood and walked to the door, leaving the three dead men behind. The valley was silent except for the mournful howl of a coyote in the distance. Rachel Langford was alone, but she was free. She walked to the well, the source of all her pain and suffering. She looked down into its dark depths, the water shimmering faintly in the moonlight. It was still poisoned, still tainted, but it was her poison now. She drew a bucket of water and carried it to the edge of her property, where the Langford land met the Miller land. She poured the water onto the parched earth, watching as it soaked into the dry soil. "This is my land," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. "And I will protect it always." She knew that what she had done was wrong, that she would likely face consequences for her actions, but she didn't care. She had avenged her family and she had reclaimed her land, and in that moment that was all that mattered. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in months, Rachel Langford felt a glimmer of hope, a hope born of steel and poison. The next morning, Sheriff Brody arrived at the Langford ranch, his face grim. He had heard the news, of course. The bodies of the Millers and Claytons had been discovered, and the rumors were already swirling through the valley. He found Rachel sitting on the porch, calmly sipping a cup of coffee. She didn't seem surprised to see him. "Rachel," he said, his voice heavy, "what happened here?" Rachel looked at him, her eyes clear and unwavering. "They poisoned my well, Sheriff," she said. "They killed my father. I did what I had to do." Brody sighed, running a hand through his thinning hair. "You know I have to take you in, Rachel," he said. "This is murder." "I know," Rachel said, her voice calm. "I'm ready." She stood and walked towards him, her head held high. She was prepared to face the consequences, knowing she had done what she believed was right. The land was hers and she had paid the price to keep it. As Brody led her away, Rachel looked back at her land, the sun rising over the horizon, casting a golden glow on the parched fields. It was a harsh land, an unforgiving land, but it was her land. She knew that her future was uncertain, that she might spend the rest of her life in prison. But she also knew that she had done what she had to do, that she had avenged her family and protected her legacy. The valley would remember Rachel Langford, not as a victim but as a survivor, a woman who had faced unimaginable loss and injustice and who had fought back with courage, cunning, and a heart full of steel, and perhaps in time the valley would understand. Perhaps in time they would forgive her. But even if they didn't, Rachel knew that she could live with her choices. She had reclaimed her land and she had found her peace. In a scorched Texas valley, a woman had finally found her justice. Years passed, the drought eventually broke and the valley bloomed again. The Langford ranch, once barren and desolate, slowly recovered. New cattle grazed on the green pastures and the well, though still tainted, provided life-giving water. Rachel Langford's name became a legend in the valley. Some whispered of her in fear, others in admiration. But all agreed on one thing: she was a force to be reckoned with. The story of the poisoned well served as a warning to those who sought to take what was not theirs. It was a reminder that even in the harshest of environments, justice could be found, and that sometimes the most unlikely of heroes could rise up to defend what was right. And so the legend of Rachel Langford lived on, a testament to the strength, resilience, and unwavering spirit of a woman who had reclaimed her land with nothing but calm, steel, and poison. The valley never forgot. The wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the scent of rain and wildflowers. The sun beat down on the valley, warming the earth and nourishing the new growth. The Langford ranch was alive again, teeming with life and hope, but the well remained. A silent testament to the darkness that had once gripped the valley, a reminder of the price that had been paid. Some said that the well was cursed, that it brought bad luck to anyone who drank from it. Others said that it was a sacred place, a symbol of resilience and strength. Rachel Langford never returned to the valley, but her spirit remained, etched into the landscape, woven into the fabric of the community. She was the woman who had stared death in the face and refused to blink. The woman who had chosen revenge over despair. The woman who had reclaimed her land with nothing but calm, steel, and poison. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The land endured, and so did her story.